So practice-based evidence. So practice-based evidence may not necessarily be empirically based, but it might be an attempt by people who have been trained Western who can either adapt the memes out of an older framework and interpret it, as it says, by the local community and use those healing ways to affect practice. So practitioners then of practice-based evidence kind of draw on cultural knowledge and traditions for treatments and are respectfully responsive to the local definition of wellness and dysfunction. So, for example, if I recall when I was talking about alcohol families and dysfunction, where Terry DeFoya talked about that dysfunction is not non-functional, dysfunctional is functioning in the presence of pain. So that in order to deal with the pain, you actually have to heal the wound, the emotional wounds first, and focus on those first. So practitioners of PB models, field-driven and expert knowledge of the cultural strengths and cultural context of the community, and they draw on that knowledge throughout the full range of service provision, so engaging, assessing, diagnosing, intervention, and aftercare, and basically using that specific language basically generated by the medical-based and evidence-based model, but basically applying cultural frameworks to that outside of the empirically based projects, which don't necessarily recognize is a culture older than 1492 or Western culture. So those evidence includes a logic-driven selection. So when we're talking about logic, it's also looking at different cultures have different types of logic systems, so that you start in a particular order that might be driven more, not so necessarily, as I was trying to show you last week with ASAM, the reason that I would tend to start with, particularly with people of color, looking at the recovery environment first and their cultural framework first, which in ASAM is 6. So if people were following a strict numerical interpretation, they'd believe that for last. But what our practice has shown us is that if you do that with certain folks, you don't to complete. You have to basically go to the place that they feel the most pain and relieve that pain first. So, simpler definition, practice-based evidence is a set of practices that are unique and inherent in a culture that have proven to be effective upon community consensus. They are in the community, so find them. They work, and they have met communities' needs for years, sometimes centuries. So one of the things I like this definition, having developed workshops around looking at how communities can define research. Research really consists of asking questions, of asking and answering questions. So any culture capable of asking and answering a question can do research. Now, whether the issue of replicability comes into play is who is it that can ask and answer those questions, and who is it that can put those into practice? If that capability is spread throughout the culture, then anybody can do them. But if it's only people that go through a university-style education and use a specific model, so randomized trials, control groups, and all that kind of stuff, asking particularly tuned questions, well, then that kind of limits the response. And then what do you do with the folks? So, what if your particular science basically doesn't deal with either, so one of the things that I talk about that comes out of Indian country is that whole question of multi-generational trauma. It might not even be your trauma that you're dealing with. It might be from previous generations. That's not even in the Western model at all. Right? So that's where that comes from. Where, yes, you can suffer, the sins of your father, the sins of your ancestors or whatever, or what your ancestors' experience was. And it does affect you today. So, and then those kind of things have to be healed in a particular way. And within Indian country, they have to be basically taken care of in ceremony. And they design ceremonies specifically for that. But what happens with folks who are cut off from that, even people in Indian country? What of them, if they're cut off from their ceremonies, how do they deal with that or not? Well, one of the ways that they've been taught to deal with that within American culture is drown their sorrows or use. So another framework that might come into play that comes out of this particular framework, but also has some applicability. There is a stage when you get people not using that they start experiencing their dreams more fully. For example, if it's marijuana, so there's 4 half-life periods in drug detox. So let's say that THC has a half-life of 7 days, hence 28 days, all right? So somewhere between day 1 to 7 and day 7 to 14, you get a REM rebound. REM, R-E-M, which is what the rock band took their name from, rapid eye movement. Basically sleep and dreaming, your eyes are moving like you're actually tracking stuff. So you get a REM rebound. That is, you probably were dreaming, but your recall isn't so great. Okay? So as the THC clears from your system, you start having more vivid dreams. We'll also find that other drugs with, say, inside of about a month of non-use, people will start having using dreams. Okay? Directly about, I'm dreaming I'm using with my friends, or they'll be coded in some way. So, for example, someone told me, well, I just had this dream. It was kind of a using dream, but I'm not really sure. I was carrying this lobster. This person was a cook. I was carrying this lobster around outside of the restaurant, and the lobster kept biting me, probably pinching, because lobster mouth parts don't do biting so much. So probably, but, and in the dream, I was carrying it around, and I couldn't let it go. Couldn't put it down. I was wandering around trying to figure out what to do with it, and it kept biting me while I was doing it, and I'm not sure what that was about. And I go, well, did you work in a seafood restaurant? No. Did you, what was up with the lobster? Why didn't you just throw it away? Well, I had to do something with it. So what did you do with lobsters in the restaurants you worked with it? Well, the lobsters that were left over, the steak place, we just turned them into lobster bisque. Okay. So what was going on with you? Well, I was drinking. I was constantly drunk that time, during that time period in my life, because he was working, restaurant industries like rock and roll, very high addictive use, very heavy drug use industry, right? So, okay, so you're, all right, so you're now a month clean and sober. And now you're starting to have not only, these drug recall dreams, but this is coded. The lobster is basically reminding you of, when you've been, to Safeway and they're having a sale of your favorite beer the night before, and you resisted. Oh, well, only one won't hurt, right? Then you have your dream where the lobster's biting you and the lobster's reminding you of your using period, right? I mean, that's fairly straightforward dream interpretation. The reason I'm talking about this in a Western framework, right? So you've got Jungian dream work. The lobster is symbolic of a time that's conscious, where you're using, right? And now you're not using and you're getting to look at, this aspect of yourself that's coming alive. Now, yeah.
I've heard and met a few people who stopped drinking and after years still haven't gotten their dreams back. Have you heard of that before?
Yeah, that could be a function of some organicity, some brain damage. Now, they shouldn't be sane.
Well, they might not be.
Theoretically, they shouldn't be sane because you have to actually, that's one of the things that does meth psychosis is that if people are basically on a run for 3 weeks or whatever, you're not sleeping, so you go crazy after 3 days. They did those experiments with the Navy in the 50s of, keeping sleep-depriving people. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture. And hallucinating after 3 days. So what would you be like after a 3-week run? So one question could be, they might not be sane, but it might be a question of recall, too. There is, when we often talk about dream work, and the reason I brought this up in the context of practice-based evidence, is that in Indian country, there's a whole framework around how you deal with what is called in English lucid dreaming. You become conscious in the dream state, and there are a number of different frameworks for looking at that. I like to use, because this comes up a lot in work, where people are using dreams. What do I do? Am I having relapse behavior? No. Well, what I like to do, let's normalize that. That's actually predictable. You have lots of environmental triggers. Yeah, you walk through Safeway, on a regular shopping trip, boom, it's my class, these environmental scans. That's why we do that. You should just think of Safeway as like enemy territory unless you're going in there to buy vegetables or something like that. Because, you notice that the beer aisle is like everywhere next to cake. Why is that there? Well, sugar and sugar. Sure makes sense, right? But there is have I mentioned Assagioli? All right. Roberto I spelled that, huh? So Assagioli Roberto, his thing is psychosynthesis. So Assagioli was a contemporary of Freud and Jung. Way less well-known Freud and Jung. But his idea, and I think one of the key things that I like to use with his stuff, because I learned this early on in my undergrad and learning about Assagioli and Freud and Jung and all that kind of stuff. So psychosynthesis, he's basically saying that there's a spiritual dimension and it's part of healthy psychology. Now, Freud basically thought that people who were spiritual were crazy, that religion is a form of psychosis. Jung goes the other way and says it's all about symbology. There are these deep archetypes. You have to integrate them into your life. Dreams are symbolic. Assagioli basically says, look, dreams are actually a level of reality. They're part of you. Just like it's daylight and you're awake in daylight, the stars are still there, even though the sun's shining. You just don't see them because the sun is shining. At night, wherever you go to sleep, your body is reacting as if it's real. Just like that facility with the neuron. The neuron cannot tell, the individual nerve cell cannot tell the difference between a real event or an imagined one. Well, what if they are real, just not physical? How would you deal with them? And so, yeah, using dreams. Are you really are you really relapsing when you use in a dream? No, not really. Unless you pee in a bottle and we find that your UA is dirty, but I haven't heard that happening. So, but it's symbolic of the desire to want to use. So if you Asagiola suggests that this is a level of reality that you're operating on just while you're asleep. And so within Indian country, we're going to talk about lucid dreaming, or in some frameworks that I have been familiar with, in Apache way, their word for sleep is little death. And the connection between death and sleep is that they're both out-of-body experiences. So that if you can become conscious in the dream state, then you're preparing for consciously dying when you finally do cross. And so then basically the technique is to learn to become conscious within the dream state and to learn to manipulate it and be conscious in it just like you are physically. And that's also a sign of psychological health. Now, naturally, that's not part of a Western framework, because if you've never heard of Asagiola, if that wasn't part of your education, it wouldn't occur to you to think to do that, right? But, right, we had those of you who are practitioners or training to be practitioners, look, you dream. And I'm not certain that people don't dream, but I think the recall might be affected in terms of if there was brain damage from their drinking or drug use. So certainly, generally that will clear up. Like with pot, we can find that starts clearing within the first week to 2 weeks or more. With other drugs, certainly within the first month. Certainly if you basically maintain somewhere around 3 years worth of abstinence, neurologically you're going to come back as far as you're going to come back. So if you're still not doing dream recall by then, look at some kind of brain damage or mental illness or whatever, but I'm not willing to go as far as mental illness yet. So I was just joking about maybe they're crazy, but I could be crazy too. And all this might be BS. So this second bullet point, go to slide if you'll, thanks. So there's no list of PBEs, so every community should document and disseminate, if culturally appropriate, effective PBEs to build the evidence, acceptance, and inclusion in funded behavioral health care delivery models and systems. So Martinez, so obviously researcher of color, basically acknowledging that, yes, we have our own science in terms of the basic test for science that is replicable and has community inclusion. But when it talks about, for example, if culturally appropriate, now there are some things, particularly within Native communities, where we might not want our secret stuff out, because we already have this phenomenon of basically people stealing our culture. And that could be problematic, or people basically saying that they're shamans and this, that, and the other, and yeah, it could be problematic. Black folks, basically, the community that raised to, study patterns of discrimination and train people to overcome them and recognize them. Yeah, well, we do disseminate that, but it's not necessarily accepted mainstream. Certainly, funded behavioral health care delivery has yet to pick up on that. So, PBEs, just like other scientific findings, may not be generalizable. That means you can export them outside of their general culture or transferable, but that should not be the goal, since we seek individualized care for children, youth, and families. They do have components in common, and that is what needs to be discovered in terms of what works among who and what doesn't work. So community-defined evidence, defined as a set of practices that communities have used and determined to yield positive results, as determined by community consensus, which may or may not have been measured empirically, that have reached a level of acceptance by that community. So for example, when I told you about crash and isms. All right, so that dates back, at least as far as written evidence, certainly among black communities as well as other communities, going back about 50 to 100 years. Some say 400. Definitely the written evidence is looking at conceptually the whole concept of intersectionality. You recall me talking about intersectionality? Crash?
Oh, yeah.
Je me rappelle. Ah oui, je me rappelle maintenant. Alors, Combahee River. The Combahee River Collective. Probably haven't mentioned them, but here's where they are. Who's who they were. Combahee River. Collective. So, Combahee River, black, lesbian, feminists. Now, they're naming themselves after the battle. So when Harriet Tubman says, "I've freed 1,000 slaves, and I could have freed thousands more if they only knew they were slaves," what she's talking about is the Combahee River action in which she freed 700 slaves. Now, she only freed 350 in the Underground Railroad. But in 1 week, in one military action where she was the general, handpicked her subordinates, took a fleet of gunboats up this river in, I believe it was South Carolina, and freed 700 slaves in a week. Now, of course, you've never heard of that, generally, right? Even in black history circles, because, right, a black woman general? Oh, no, you heard about that, then women might want to join the military and think that they're capable of leading combat troops. Can't have that. So they call themselves after that obscure action, and their statement, which is basically quoted in Peggy McIntosh's White Male Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. So you can actually Google on that term, and Peg will list somewhere between 23 to 46, depending on which version you Google, about elements of white male privilege, where she's saying, okay, I'm a white woman, and I was first coming to this as a feminist, saying, okay, what are these privileges that men have as part of gender privilege that they have that I don't have? And then how would I apply that as a white woman to looking at issues around race? What is my privilege? So what are the invisible knapsack that has codes and maps and all these other things that are part of their privileges being white? So one of the things that she quotes within her piece is the Combahee River Collective statement. So these black lesbian feminists writing in the late 60s talk about, okay, we're lesbians, we're feminists, and unlike our white lesbian sisters who choose to be separatists, so if you didn't know that about lesbian culture, that there are separatists that say, okay, we're not going to have anything to do with men, and we'll separate and create our own separate communities from men. These black lesbian feminists are saying, we can't do that, because basically, like black men, we face racism, we also face classism, we also face homophobia within black men and within the larger culture. We face classism, we face all these different intersecting systems of discrimination. So taking that statement, developing the construct crash, classism, racism, addiction, sexism, heterosexism. So instead of 5, there's actually 10 within this particular framework. So the idea crash is intersectionality. Okay, so community-defined evidence. In order to recognize that, so Western psychology doesn't say that racism exists. Black psychology says, yeah, hell yeah, it exists. In fact, there's at least 6 types of it, 6 levels of it. All right, so separate piece of literature under race where you have 6 types of isms. In the black literature that studies racism systemically. So 2 types of individual, 4 types of institutional. Okay, under race. So then in terms of intersectionality, saying, okay, all these interact. So you have to know how racism is constructed, and then classism is constructed, and then addiction and ability and age, how those are constructed. Sexism, how is that constructed? Heterosexism, how is that constructed? And how do they interact? So in intersectionality, we're not saying that there's an oppression Olympics. Okay, just like in Hawkins-Catalano risk-focused prevention, what happens if a person has more risks? Does that mean they will develop a substance abuse problem? Not necessarily. So as an example, well, let me finish intersectionality, and then I think in the last 5 minutes we'll talk about risk versus resiliency. So it's not an oppression Olympics. So a black, blind, lesbian who's agnostic or Muslim in a wheelchair is not, may be more oppressed than an able-bodied white man, but if she's the CEO of an organization, there's a power differential between them. There are certain barriers that are systemic. So it's not who's more oppressed than who. It's how do these things interact, and if above this line you have privilege and below this line you're a target, where are you a target and where are you above the line? So for example, with me, thanks. I'm above the line for class, the line for race, above the line for addiction, below the line for age, above the line for ability, above the line for sex, and above the line for heterosex. Right? So I'm only a target in 3 or 4 categories. Right? So I'm above the line for class, meaning as a college professor, I'm upper middle class. But if I had above the line for means that if you had like a major accident and an $80,000 medical bill, would it wipe you out? If it does wipe you out, you're below the line. If it doesn't wipe you out, you're above the line. Okay? For age, I'm 58, so I'm not employable if I leave. If I'm below 50, I'm employable. But if you're too young, you're below the line too, right? So you have to be in that between 21 to 40 something to be above the line. So you see the line shifts depending on who's doing the definition. Now, one last piece about risk-focused prevention. There used to be this concept of risk and resiliency. Now, risk, the more risks you had, so risk was not really conceived of the flip side of resiliency, because within that model, one of the things that we notice is that many people had lots of risks. but they weren't necessarily getting strung out on drugs. They came from high-risk environments or even risk-producing environments and didn't succumb. So one of the things that we noticed, so 1 in 3 children born in poverty replicate that poverty as adults. 1 in 4 children of alcoholics developed alcoholism. 1 in 9 children grew up in mental illness, a specific mental illness with schizophrenia. I know I spelled that wrong. Schizo, but thank you. And I have psychology, right? SCZ, schizophrenia? Oh, well. Anyway, you get the idea. Schizophrenia. Thanks. All right, so the one. So one of the things you notice if you invert the numbers is most people are making it. 3 people out of the 1 in 3 are not replicating poverty. Most of the children of alcoholics are making it, and most of the people in houses of mental illness, homes where there's mental illness, are not developing that mental illness. What's protecting them? I.e. protective factors. So that was another evidence-based piece in looking at, okay, what do we focus on? What keeps these folks resilient? And it's not the opposite of risk, they found. It's an entirely different framework where you basically practice that what makes you strong and study that. Which also dovetails with combined evidence too. Because, all right, we have all these risks, but here's how you become strong. And one of the ways that you become strong is noticing what are the sets of oppressions that you face and what you need to do to get yourself above the line. So in terms of class, that might be vocabulary. You appear to be well-read. You speak a certain way. You carry yourself a certain way. You dress a certain way. Because one of the things you notice with people is their gender, their race, and how they're dressed. Right? Would a man in a business suit, flying sign, work for flying sign? Probably not. No credibility. Right? So you have to look like you're down on your luck to elicit sympathy. Right? That's a class piece. So we'll continue more on Thursday. You can have it done then? Yes.
Online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.